Hello class 9, Shubha teacher is back again with another video. This is the first video of chapter 5, Pollination and Fertilization. In chapter 4, you had studied about the structure of flower in detail. Since flower is the reproductive part of a plant, we need to now learn about the entire process of reproduction. To understand the process, we need to understand the two steps of it, pollination and fertilization. In this video, I am going to talk to you about pollination. Pollination is defined as the process of transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. Here are anthers and stigma shown in this bisexual flower. Anther is at the tip of stamen, the male part of a flower, and stigma is the top part of the female part of the flower, that is carpel. One more thing to be noted here is that pollination takes place either within the same plant or between plants of same species. The term species means it is a group of organisms in which two organisms are capable of producing a normal fertile young one. A normal fertile young one means the one which is able to again further produce a normal young one. Here is a figure which shows you the kinds of pollination. Let's look at the arrows. The arrows are depicting transfer of pollen grains. Arrow A shows the transfer of pollen grains from anther of this flower to stigma of the same flower. So such a pollination is termed as autogamy. B shows transfer of pollen grains from one flower to stigma of another flower of the same plant. This pollination is termed as geitonogamy. C arrow shows the transfer of pollen grains from anther of a flower of one plant to stigma of a flower of a separate plant. Such a pollination is termed as cross-pollination. It is a cross between two plants. It is also scientifically called as allogamy. Let's look at the definition of the kinds of self-pollination. Self-pollination is of three types: autogamy, geitonogamy, and cleistogamy. Autogamy and geitonogamy I had discussed with you in the previous slide. Let's look at the definitions. The process of transfer of pollen grains from anther of a flower to stigma of the same flower, it is termed as autogamy. When this transfer of pollen grains from anther of a flower to stigma of another flower of same plant takes place, it is termed as geitonogamy. The third type of self-pollination is cleistogamy. This pollination takes place in permanently closed flowers. To understand cleistogamy, I have taken two examples here of a pea flower and pansy flower. If you observe the structure of pea flower, the petals are like hood, which almost covers the internal, that is the essential parts of the flowers. So therefore, self-pollination takes place inside it. Pansy flower also has its sexual parts, that is stamen and carpel, hidden inside. From top, you can see only the petals, the bright colored petals. Here, deep inside the flower, this self-pollination takes place between the two parts. Now we need to know when can self-pollination occur. There are two conditions, bisexuality and homogamy, which promote self-pollination. Bisexuality means flowers having both male and female parts in them. When a flower has got both male and female parts, then self-pollination becomes possible. Homogamy means maturity of anther and stigma at the same time. In case a flower is a bisexual flower and the two reproductive parts, male and female, anther and stigma, doesn't mature at the same time, then self-pollination cannot occur. So therefore, homogamy is an important condition which promotes self-pollination. This process has got some advantages and disadvantages with it. Let's start with advantages. Self-pollination is a surer method. Very true. It is sure because it takes place within the same plant. It doesn't have to, move. The pollen grains doesn't need to move from one place to another. So therefore, it's a sure method. Parental characters are preserved. Since the pollen grains of one parent moves to the stigma of the same plant, therefore parental characters are preserved. There is no mixing of two varieties. No wastage of pollen grains take place. Very true, because the pollen grains don't need to transfer much. They don't need to move to larger distance. Flowers need not be large and showy. Scent and nectar are not required. Now these four characteristics, large size, attractive color of the flower, scent of the flower, and nectar, these things are required to attract the pollinators, that is the agents of pollination. When these are not required here in self-pollination, therefore they don't need to spend that much of nutrients in producing large flowers and in producing nectar. So therefore self-pollination is economical. It is beneficial for the plant. There are some disadvantages of self-pollination. This process leads to weakening of the variety. Now, since the characteristics of the same plant get transferred from one generation to another, so therefore the variety becomes weak. Weaker or defective characters cannot be eliminated. That's very true. If whatever kind of characteristics are there in the parent, it is a weak one or bright one, both remain in the plant and they get transferred to the offsprings. They cannot be eliminated because there is no other characteristic which can suppress the defective one. It does not yield new varieties because there is no mixing of two different varieties taking place in this pollination. Let's move on to the next kind of pollination, that is cross-pollination. Cross, that is between two plants. So it's defined as the process of transfer of pollen grains from anther of a flower of one plant to the stigma of a flower of another plant of same species. Alright, so cross-pollination takes place between two plants of same species. Now, since in this the transfer of pollen grains takes place from one plant to another, therefore agents of pollinations are required. Here in this figure, honey bee is the agent of pollination. The agents of pollination are called as pollinators. Even this process has got some advantages and disadvantages. Advantages. Offsprings produced in cross-pollination are healthier. It is because it is a cross between two varieties or two different plants. So therefore, the characteristics remain dominant and healthy in the plant. Seeds produced are abundant. It is seen that the seeds produced in these kinds of flowers are abundant. So therefore, we can grow more number of plants. There are new varieties produced because it is a cross between two different varieties. So therefore, the offsprings gets characteristics from both the varieties of plants. The disadvantages of cross-pollination is it is not always certain. Yes, since this pollination involves transfer of pollen grains from one plant to another, so therefore it is not certain. It may happen that the pollen grains fall on the stigma of some other species of plant. It may also happen that the pollen grains does not land up in a proper place. So therefore, it is not always certain. The next point is it leads to a lot of wastage of pollen grains. Yes, in case it is carried by wind, then when the speed of the wind lessens, the pollen grains may fall in some other place. So therefore, the pollen grains get wasted a lot. And Since pollinators like bee and birds are required for cross-pollination, so a cross-pollinated flower needs to be large, showy, it also needs to have scent and nectar, which will involve usage of a lot of nutrients in it. So therefore, this process is uneconomical for the plant. It is not beneficial. With this, we come to the end of today's video. Let's do a quick recap. In this video, you learnt about the concept of pollination, the various kinds of pollination, self and cross. You also came to know about the conditions when self-pollination can occur, the two conditions, that is bisexuality and homogamy, and advantages and disadvantages of self and cross-pollination. That's all for today, children. We'll move on with the topic in the next video. Thank you.